Your grandmother could feed 8 people on a single chicken and the heel of a ham bone, and she did not call it poverty. She called it Sunday. Her cast iron sat on the same back eye of the stove for 40 years, and the grease tin on the windowsill was older than her marriage. Number 19 fed a family of 7 on 12 cents in 1934. Number 8 was the curry the South claimed as its own after a sea captain dropped it on the Savannah docks. Number 1 was so dignified that General Patton asked the Army to put it in his field rations. These 25 dishes were not poverty food. They were the proudest plates in the South, cooked by people who turned scarcity into supper. Hit subscribe and stay with us. Here are the 25 forgotten Southern meals our grandparents were proud of, now gone forever. Number 25, liver mush. Your grandmother bought a cold gray brick at the Cleveland County Market for 10 cents a pound, sliced it the thickness of a domino, and laid it in a hot iron skillet before the rooster was done complaining. The crust came up brown and crisp, the inside stayed soft as warm pudding, and she served it next to grits and a fried egg with the yolk still loose. Pig liver, head meat, cornmeal, and black pepper. German immigrants brought the idea down the Shenandoah Valley in the 1700s, and by the time it reached the North Carolina Piedmont, it had a new name. The Daily Meal calls it the poor man's pâté, and in 1934, a working family fed 5 mouths on one 10-cent block 3 days a week, the way other folks ate sausage. Shelby still throws a liver mush festival every June, but the daily breakfast plate, fried at 6 in the morning, is mostly gone. Today, the same gray block is a curiosity on a charcuterie board. Number 24, salt rising bread. The dough sat overnight in a warm spot near the stove, fed by wild bacteria the baker never named and never saw. By morning, it smelled like old cheese and fermented corn, and your grandmother knew the loaf was ready by the sour bite at the back of her nose. She baked it dense and white in a hot oven, and the slices stood up to country butter and apple butter the way no modern bread does. The first written recipe shows up in 1778 in what is now West Virginia, before commercial yeast existed in the United States. Pioneer women kept the technique alive across the southern Appalachians for a century. The bread was simple, cheap, and effective in a cabin that had no money for store-bought leavening. And in the 1860s, commercial yeast walked in clean and predictable, and the wild bread walked out. A handful of bakers in Pennsylvania and West Virginia still keep the bacteria alive. Most people under 60 have never smelled a loaf rising. Number 23, hoe cake. A flat iron tool sat in the coals of the hearth, and a thin batter of cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt hissed onto the metal like a struck match. No buttermilk, no egg, no leavening. Your great-great-grandmother turned it once with a knife, and it came off the iron the size of a small plate, blistered on top and stiff at the edge. Enslaved cooks in Virginia and the Carolinas cooked them in the field for a midday meal because the tool, the meal, and the fire were all you needed. Mount Vernon kitchen logs show George Washington asked for them most mornings under butter and honey. By 1900, the hearth was gone, the cornmeal had moved to the supermarket aisle, and the hoe cake quietly became the modern pancake. But the original is heavier, plainer, and was eaten with greasy fingers. Number 22, Ashcake. This one went a step lower. No iron, no skillet, no hoe. Your grandmother's grandmother wrapped the cornmeal dough in a cabbage leaf, or sometimes a green corn husk, and pushed the bundle into the gray ashes at the back of the fireplace. 20 minutes covered in coal dust, and out came a hard little loaf the children peeled and ate with cold pork or salted fish. Cherokee and Choctaw cooks were baking corn this way long before the cabin showed up, and enslaved field hands kept the method alive when no other tool was allowed in the quarters. The taste is plain. The story is not. By the time gas stoves arrived in rural Mississippi in the 1940s, the technique had nearly died. The cabbage leaf went in the soup pot, the cornmeal went into a box, and the ash cake outlasted 3 centuries because the recipe needed nothing but a fire and a leaf, which is exactly why it disappeared the moment something easier showed up. Number 21, sawmill gravy. The cook in an Appalachian logging camp had bacon grease, flour, and water. She did not have milk most days because the cow stayed home with the family. So the gravy went into the pan, thin and brown, the consistency of buttermilk, and the men ate it on cold biscuits before walking 5 miles to the cut. Some folks called it bulldog gravy. Some called it pourdu. Sausage and cream came later, after the trains brought refrigeration into the mountains. The original was the Sunday breakfast of a man whose paycheck was company scrip and whose lunch was the same biscuit cold at noon. By the time Cracker Barrel put thick white gravy on the menu in 1969, the brown working version was nearly extinct. Old-timers in Buncombe County still remember the difference. But ask a modern diner what Sawmill gravy is, and they will say sausage and cream. Number 20, Redeye gravy. The same iron skillet that fried country ham held the gift. Your grandfather poured a half cup of cold black coffee into the hot pork drippings, scraped the brown bits with a spoon, and let the whole thing cook down for 2 minutes. The fat rose into a single shimmering circle in the middle of the pan, and the dark coffee gathered at the rim like a stained eye looking back. Some folks called it bird eye gravy, some called it bottom slop. Andrew Jackson is supposed to have asked his cook for ham with gravy as red as a hangover, and the name stuck whether the story did or not. A field hand drank his coffee in the gravy and ate his biscuit on the side. Most diners now pour milk gravy on the ham and never mention the coffee at all. The thin red sauce, simple and powerful, has been replaced by something thicker and easier and less interesting. Number 19. Hoppin John. A black iron pot, a pound of dried cow peas, a ham bone with a little smoke left on it, and a heap of long-grain rice from the rice fields outside Charleston. Your great-aunt cooked it on January 1st because the peas looked like coins and the greens beside them looked like folded dollar bills. She left 3 peas on her plate for luck and made the children do the same. The dish came up out of the South Carolina Sea Islands in the hands of Gullah Geechee cooks who carried the memory of Thibu Nebi across the Atlantic in the holds of ships. A widow in St. Helena fed 7 children on 12 cents of peas and a smoked neck bone in 1934. The recipe was passed down hand to hand, mother to daughter, for 200 years. But modern Charleston restaurants charge $22 for a bowl with shaved truffle and call it elevated. The original was Sunday food eaten with a tin spoon. Number 18, chicken and slicks. In western North Carolina, the dumplings were not fluffy white pillows like the ones you see on a chain restaurant menu. Your grandmother rolled the dough thin as a playing card on a floured table, cut it in long ribbons with a kitchen knife, and dropped the strips into a pot of stewing hen and broth. They came out chewy, dense, and slick on the tongue, and that is where the name lived. Eastern North Carolina called the same dish chicken and pastry. Mountain folks said chicken and slicks. Mary Randolph wrote a version of it in The Virginia Housewife in 1824, and the dish was already old then. A hen too tough to roast went into the pot with celery and an onion, simmered for 3 hours, and the strips of dough went in last, so they kept their bite. And that bite is the whole point. Today, most chains use airy biscuit dough, and the dish has gone soft, both literally and as a memory. Number 17, Brunswick stew. 2 states still fight about who invented it. Virginia points to 1828, when an enslaved cook named Jimmy Matthews fed a hunting party of Creed Haskins from a black iron pot of squirrel and stale bread. Georgia points to St. Simon's Island in 1898 and a different iron pot with a plaque on it. Both pots were big enough to feed a Saturday crowd. The stew was tomato-based, thick enough to hold a spoon upright, and built from squirrel, rabbit, or whatever the hunters carried home. By the 1930s, a chicken had taken the small game's place because the squirrel had moved on and the children no longer hunted. Brunswick County still simmers it for political rallies and church suppers. Your grandfather knew the difference between a pot cooked 4 hours over hickory and the canned version that showed up at the grocery in 1955. The hickory pot tasted like the place it came from. The canned version tasted like nothing in particular. Number 16, Scrapple. November was hog-killing time, And on a cold Saturday morning, the men hung the carcass from a tree in the backyard and the women started the pots. Your great-grandmother saved every scrap that did not go into ham or sausage, simmered it for hours with cornmeal and sage and black pepper, poured the loose mush into a bread tin, and let it firm up on the back porch in the cold air. Slice it the next morning, fry it in lard until the edges curled crisp, and serve it next to 2 over-easy eggs and a smear of apple butter. The Pennsylvania Dutch called it panhas. The Mountain South called it scrapple, and ate it 3 days a week through winter. After 1960, when small farms stopped killing their own hogs, the scrapple block disappeared from most pantries. The recipe was simple, cheap, and powerful in a household that wasted nothing. But once the hog stopped hanging in the backyard, the gray block could not survive the trip to the supermarket. A Philadelphia diner still keeps it on the menu. Most Southern kitchens do not. Number 15. Souse meat. The same hog-killing day that made scrapple also made souse. Your grandfather boiled the head, the feet, the ears, and any odd bits left over, picked the meat off the bones, packed it into a stoneware crock with vinegar, hot peppers, and pickling spice, and weighted it down with a clean stone. 3 days later, it was a cold, jellied, sour, sharp meat that sliced clean and went on saltines. Working folks ate it for a quick lunch in the field and called it good. Mississippi knew it as hog's head cheese, hot and red with cayenne. North Carolina knew it as souse, milder, sourer. The crock sat on the cold porch all winter, ready when somebody got hungry. Refrigeration killed the home crock. The supermarket killed the rest. Most of your grandchildren will never taste a slice. Number 14. Country Captain chicken. A chicken cut in 8 pieces, browned in a black skillet, and finished in a fragrant tomato curry the color of brick dust. Onion, green pepper, raisins, almonds, and a heavy hand of curry powder. The dish came up the Savannah docks in the early 1800s with British East India sea captains who had eaten it for years in port towns along the Indian coast. By 1857, it was printed in Miss Leslie's new cookery book in Philadelphia. By 1942, Franklin Roosevelt was eating it in Warm Springs, Georgia, off a heavy china plate. He fed it to George Patton, and Patton liked it so much that the United States Army added a country captain ration to the field menu in his honor in 2000. Your grandmother served it on white rice with toasted almonds on top and called it Sunday company food. The Junior League of Charleston printed her version in the 1950s. Most churches stopped serving it sometime around 1985. Number 13. Fried green tomatoes. Late August in Alabama, when the last green tomatoes still hung on the vine and a hard frost was coming. Your grandmother sliced them thick, dredged them in cornmeal and a little flour, salted them, and dropped them in a black skillet of bacon grease. They came out the color of summer corn, crisp on the outside, tart and firm in the middle. She served them next to a slice of pink ham and a wedge of cantaloupe. The recipe shows up in an Ohio cookbook in 1873, decades before Fanny Flagg made the Whistle Stop Cafe famous in 1987. The Irondale Cafe outside Birmingham is still open and still serves them. The home version, fried in last night's bacon grease on a Tuesday, has mostly vanished. The supermarket only sells red tomatoes now. Number 12. Tomato gravy. Late August again, this time at supper. Your grandmother poured bacon grease into the iron skillet, stirred in flour for a brown roux, then dumped in a quart jar of last summer's stewed tomatoes she had canned in July. Salt, black pepper, a little sugar to cut the acid, and 20 minutes on a low flame. She poured it hot over split biscuits, and the family ate it for breakfast on a Saturday in 1936, when there was no sausage left in the smokehouse. A working farm fed 8 people on a quart of tomatoes, 3 biscuits each, and a glass of buttermilk. The recipe walked out the door when the canning shelf walked out with it. Most modern cookbooks list tomato gravy as a regional curiosity, and most grandchildren under 30 have never sat down to a plate. Number 11. Calas, Sunday morning in the French Quarter, around 1841. Creole women carried covered baskets through the streets outside St. Louis Cathedral. calling out Bel Calas, tout chaud, and the fasting Catholics came down their front steps with a nickel in hand. The fritter inside the basket was leftover rice, mixed with egg, sugar, flour, and nutmeg, fried in hot lard until the outside cracked like sugar glass. Slaves from the rice country of West Africa brought the technique with them in the 1700s, and the name itself comes from the Nupe word kara, meaning fried cake. For 150 years, the Calas vendors of New Orleans funded their own freedom one nickel at a time. More than 1,400 enslaved women bought their families out of bondage under Spanish rule. Between the two world wars, the street vendors disappeared. A handful of Mardi Gras households still fry them on Tuesday morning. Your grandmother probably never tasted one. Number 10. Persimmon pudding. Wait for the first hard frost in southern Indiana, the Ohio River bottoms, the Kentucky hills. Wait for the wild persimmons to drop from the tree on their own, because picked early, they will pucker your mouth shut like a drawstring. Your grandmother gathered them in a tin pail, pressed the pulp through a colander to lose the seeds, and stirred it into flour, sugar, milk, eggs, cinnamon, and nutmeg. 45 minutes in a slow oven, and it came out dense, dark, moist, somewhere between gingerbread and steamed pudding. The Cherokee were making versions of it long before Indiana was a state. By 1947, the town of Mitchell, Indiana, had started a persimmon festival around the dessert. The home version, served warm under a spoon of sweet cream on a Saturday in October, has mostly faded. Most stores do not even carry the native fruit. Number 9. Pawpaw fritters. The pawpaw is the largest native fruit in North America, and almost nobody under 50 has tasted one. The flesh is the color of a bruised banana, and the flavor is somewhere between mango and custard, with a custardy texture you cannot find in any supermarket aisle. Your great-grandmother in eastern Kentucky walked the creek bank in early September with a cloth bag and gathered the soft fruit off the ground. She mashed the pulp, mixed it with flour, egg, sugar, and a pinch of cinnamon, dropped spoonfuls in hot lard, and dusted them with powdered sugar before the children could grab them. The Iroquois cooked the fruit into corn cakes long before settlers came over the Cumberland Gap. Enslaved people on the Underground Railroad ate them along the way because they grew wild and free. The fruit will not ship and will not store, so the supermarket will not stock it. A wild pawpaw tree still drops fruit every fall in 26 states. Almost no grandchildren go looking. Number 8. Country Captain Rice Plate. The same Indian curry from earlier, served a different way. Late summer Charleston, your great-aunt's dining room, a heavy china plate, a mound of long-grain rice in the center, the chicken laid over it, the brick-red sauce poured around the edges, toasted almonds on top, fat raisins on the side, a little chutney in a pressed glass bowl. This was Sunday company food, served when the preacher came home for dinner. The 1950 Junior League of Charleston cookbook printed the canonical version, and your grandmother had a copy with butter stains on page 47. After 1985, the dish almost disappeared from white tablecloth menus. A few southern restaurants in Savannah and Charleston still keep it on the lunch list. The plates went home to the cabinet. The almonds went stale in the can. The story stayed in Patton's field rations and almost nowhere else. The dish is still simple to make. It just needs somebody to remember it. Number 7. Lane Cake. Emma Rylander. Lane of Clayton, Alabama, took her 4-layer white sponge cake to a county fair in Columbus, Georgia in 1898 and won first prize. She named it the prize cake. A neighbor talked her into using her own name on the recipe, and she printed it that year in a self-published cookbook called Some Good Things to Eat. The cake itself is white sponge, 4 tall layers, filled with a cooked custard of egg yolks, sugar, butter, raisins, pecans, and a heavy pour of bourbon whiskey. Your great-aunt brought one to every Easter dinner from 1925 to 1971, kept it under a glass dome on the sideboard, and let it sit 2 days so the bourbon worked its way into the crumb the way ink works into blotting paper. Harper Lee made it the cake that defined Maycomb in To Kill a Mockingbird. Alabama voted it the official state cake in 2016. The home version on the sideboard is mostly gone. Modern weddings hire a pastry chef and call it a tier. Your great-aunt called it Easter. Number 6. Tomato pie. A flaky pie crust, a layer of thick sliced summer tomatoes salted and drained on a paper towel for an hour, a heap of grated sharp cheddar, a generous spoon of Duke's mayonnaise from the jar, and 20 minutes in a hot oven. Eugenia Duke started selling that mayonnaise from her Greenville, South Carolina, kitchen in 1917, and she made every sandwich for the soldiers at Camp Sevier herself. By the early 1970s, the tomato pie was showing up in church potluck cookbooks across the Carolinas, Georgia, and East Tennessee. Your grandmother served a slice at Sunday lunch in late July with a tall glass of sweet tea and called it the best thing on the table. The cheese on top, melted and gold-spotted, smelled like the inside of a screened porch on a still afternoon. Most home cooks under 40 have never made one. The Hot Tomato Summer event in Richmond is keeping the dish alive in restaurants, but the home version, eaten on a screened porch with the cicadas going, has mostly gone quiet. Number 5. Tomato and bread soup. A ribbon mill town in Spartanburg, South Carolina, 1933. The textile workers came home with empty pockets and the wives turned a quart of canned tomatoes, a heel of stale white bread, a chopped onion, and a pinch of sugar into a hot supper for 6. 20 minutes on the back of the wood stove, and the bread broke down into the broth, thick as oatmeal, sweet as the August garden. They called it tomato dumplings in some kitchens and tomato bread in others. Your great-grandmother made it on a Tuesday because Tuesday was the day before the new bread came out of the oven and the old loaf had to go somewhere. Pellagra was killing thousands of poor Southerners in the 1930s, and a steaming bowl of tomato bread was one of the things that kept it out of a working family's house. Today, nobody under 60 knows the name. The bread goes in the trash. The tomatoes come out of a can with 23 other ingredients on the label. Number 4. Biscuits and tomato gravy and an egg. Your grandfather's working breakfast, fed to him in 1948 in a kitchen in northern Alabama, eaten in 7 minutes before the train whistle blew at the cotton mill. Biscuits split in half on a thick white plate. A ladle of red tomato gravy from the night before, warmed in the iron skillet. A fried egg with the yolk still loose on top of the pile. A cup of black coffee on the side, no sugar, no cream. He stood up, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and walked the half-mile to the gate. By 1980, the cotton mill had closed. The kitchen had a microwave, and the coffee came out of a glass pot somebody had forgotten to turn off. The plate went to the cabinet. The biscuit went to the freezer aisle. The breakfast that kept the working South on its feet for 6 generations went quiet. Number 3. Sunday dinner chicken and dumplings. The hen was already old. She had laid for 4 years, and the eggs had slowed down. So your grandmother took her off the roost on Saturday night, dressed her on Sunday morning before church, and started the pot when she got home in her best dress. 3 hours covered on a low flame with celery, a yellow onion, a sprig of thyme, and a little salt. The meat fell off the bone. She rolled the dough thin on the kitchen table, cut the strips with a paring knife, and dropped them in last. The men carved the rest of the meat into a covered dish. The women set the table with the good plates. 3 generations sat down at 1 o'clock, said Grace, and ate without speaking for the first 10 minutes because the food was that good. By 2005, most American Sundays did not have a sit-down dinner anywhere on the calendar. The hens are gone. The dumplings are mostly gone with them. The table itself is in storage in half the houses in the South. Number 2. Brunswick stew at a church homecoming. A black iron kettle the size of a wash tub set up on a cinder block tripod under a tin shed behind the country church. Hickory under the kettle, glowing low. 8 hours of slow cooking. 2 old hens, 3 pounds of pork shoulder, 4 cans of stewed tomatoes from last summer's garden, butter beans, cream-style corn, an onion, a chopped potato, a long pour of vinegar, a pinch of red pepper, and 1 woman with a wooden paddle as long as a canoe oar. Brunswick County, Virginia did it this way for political rallies after 1828. The Methodists in Middle Georgia did it after 1898. Your grandfather's home church in Greene County did it every August for the homecoming dinner on the grounds. The kettle sat under the shed, and the women took turns stirring, and the men told the same 5 stories every year. After 2010, the homecoming dinners shrank, then ended. Then nobody could find the kettle. The stew is on a few menus in a few towns. The shed is empty. Number 1, salt rising bread, hot from the oven, with butter and apple butter, on a Saturday morning in 1932. This is the dish that bookends the list because it bookended the South. Your great-grandmother started the starter on Friday night near the back of the cook stove, fed it cornmeal mush at midnight, and let it work through the cold hours like a small animal she was keeping warm. By 6 on Saturday morning, the kitchen smelled like aged cheese and warm corn and yeast. The loaf was rising in a tin pan, and the children were standing at the door waiting for the heel. She sliced it thick, smeared it with home-churned butter, spooned apple butter on top from a quart jar with a paper and string lid, and the family ate the entire loaf before noon. The technique came over the Cumberland Gap in the 1790s and stayed alive in a few cabins until the 1960s. What most people miss is that this bread was not survival food. It was the sweetest, proudest thing on a poor table, and your grandmother served it on a Saturday morning the way other people served champagne. The crust was the color of polished walnut. The crumb was bright white and tight as old linen. The smell stayed in the kitchen for 3 days. Researchers have since identified the wild bacteria that does the lifting, mostly Clostridium perfringens, which gives the loaf its dense white crumb. A handful of bakers in West Virginia still feed a starter and bake the loaf the old way. Most of your grandchildren will never smell a bread like that rising on a Saturday morning. The bacteria lives in the air the way a memory lives in a kitchen, invisible and stubborn, waiting for somebody to pull it down and feed it. Boiled peanut and rice croquettes combined coastal Carolina flavors into a quick dish that brought the harvest of field and water to one plate. Grandmothers boiled green peanuts until tender, then ground them with cooked rice and a sprinkle of herbs to form a rich, nutty mixture. Small portions were shaped into balls and pan-fried until crisp and golden, creating a crunchy shell around a soft, flavorful center. The earthy peanuts paired beautifully with the mild rice, offering a satisfying snack or side dish that reflected both ingenuity and local abundance. These croquettes were perfect for gatherings when guests arrived unexpectedly because the ingredients were simple and the cooking time short. Children loved their bite-sized shape, while adults enjoyed the unique blend of flavors rarely found beyond the Carolina coast. Boiled peanut and rice croquettes showcased the creative ways Southern grandmothers honored regional crops and proved that a humble pairing could become something special with just a hot pan and skilled hands. Parsnip and carrot mash was a rustic dish that felt both hearty and refined, depending on how Grandma served it. She would boil peeled carrots and parsnips until soft, then mash them with butter, salt, and just a dash of cream or broth. The result was a golden mash with a hint of sweetness and a whisper of spice, thanks to the natural flavors of the vegetables. It was lighter than mashed potatoes, but still deeply satisfying. Often served alongside roast chicken or pork, it brought color and comfort to the table. Parsnips had a stronger flavor than carrots, so Grandma would sometimes tone it down with a bit of apple or potato if she had it. The mash was served hot, usually with a pat of butter melting into the top, and it filled the kitchen with a rich, earthy smell. These days, most people skip parsnips altogether or never think to mash them, but this was a dish that stretched garden roots into something nourishing and beautiful. It was humble food made with care, and that made all the difference. Macaroni and tomatoes was the forgotten side that kept dinner plates full when grocery budgets were stretched thin. You would boil macaroni, toss it with stewed tomatoes, a pat of butter, and maybe onions or cheese if you had extra. It was not glamorous, but it got the job done. You could find this simple pasta side in old community cookbooks from the 40s through the 70s, tucked between casserole recipes and Jell-O molds. Families loved it because it used pantry staples, cost little, and made meals stretch farther. It showed up next to pork chops, meatloaf, or whatever leftovers you had. Macaroni and tomatoes was the quiet hero of the table, filling bellies when money was tight. You do not see it much now, but in its day, it was a practical filling side that showed how far folks could go with a box of pasta and a can of tomatoes. Corn dodgers were a humble food that carried workers through long days in the fields or on the road. Made from cornmeal, salt, and water, sometimes enriched with lard, the dough was shaped into small cakes and fried or baked. They were sturdy, portable, and filling, making them perfect for laborers who needed food that could travel. Families packed them into lunch pails, and soldiers carried them during the Civil War, keeping the tradition alive for generations. Corn dodgers were often eaten plain, but sometimes dipped in molasses or gravy if available. They symbolized a kind of practical cooking where function mattered more than luxury. Though simple, they were tied to the rhythms of work, hunger, and endurance. Today, corn dodgers are rarely seen outside of history books or reenactments, forgotten in favor of softer breads and convenience foods. Yet their story reminds us how much people relied on ingenuity to make basic grains stretch. Corn dodgers were never glamorous, but they were dependable. Bear-fat biscuits carried the taste of hard wilderness living and the quiet ingenuity of hunters who used every resource. When butter or lard ran out, rendered bear fat provided a rich, earthy flavor and the perfect texture for flaky biscuits cooked in heavy cast-iron pans over open fires. Hunters melted the fat slowly to remove impurities, then mixed it with flour, a pinch of salt, and cold spring water to form a soft dough that baked into golden rounds. The biscuits emerged tender inside with crisp edges that held the subtle smokiness of the bear itself, making them a breakfast strong enough to last through hours of tracking or chopping wood. Families living deep in the mountains often saved bear hunts for late autumn when the animals were fattened for winter, ensuring the rendered fat would last for months of baking and frying. Modern kitchens rarely use such an ingredient, yet those who remember describe a depth of flavor and resilience that ordinary butter can never equal, a flavor earned through effort and respect for the wild. Creamed pearl tapioca was a dish that confused most people the first time they saw it, but it had a quiet charm that stuck. Grandma would cook the tiny pearls slowly until they turned translucent and soft, then fold them into a thick, savory base with cheese, onions, or even bits of ham or mushrooms. It was like a casserole crossed with a pudding. Strange, but comforting. The texture was warm and creamy, with a soft bite that held everything together. You would not find it on many dinner tables today, but back then, it was a way to stretch ingredients and use up pantry staples in unexpected ways. It was often baked until the top turned golden and set, then scooped onto the plate beside a roast or served in ramekins for something a little more refined. It had a richness that felt out of place for how inexpensive it was to make. Most people remember tapioca as a sweet dessert, but this version belonged to the savory world, and it was a world all its own. Muscadine skillet cobbler celebrated the thick-skinned wild grapes that ripened late in southern summers, filling the air with their musky perfume. Grandmothers simmered the grapes with sugar until the juices turned deep purple, then poured the bubbling fruit into a cast-iron skillet lined with a simple cornmeal batter. As it baked, the batter rose through the grapes, creating golden pockets that soaked up the sweet syrup. The cobbler emerged fragrant and richly colored, a dessert that captured the fleeting taste of the wild vines. Families often picked the grapes together, braving tangled thickets for the reward of a warm evening treat. Served with fresh cream or enjoyed plain, each spoonful offered a burst of tart sweetness and the satisfaction of food gathered by hand. Muscadine skillet cobbler remains a reminder of late summer nights, family foraging trips, and the joy of transforming wild fruit into a rustic masterpiece that could never be replicated with store-bought grapes. Hominy casserole bake was one of those hearty, dependable sides that quietly held southern kitchens together, especially when every meal had to count. You would take cooked hominy, mix it with shredded cheese, a little cream, top it with breadcrumbs, and bake it until bubbling and golden. It was simple, filling, and made sure nothing went to waste. Hominy casserole bake showed up at church suppers, family reunions, and holidays, especially in rural areas where pantry staples had to stretch. It might sound old-fashioned now, but this cheesy casserole was pure comfort on a plate, adding a little richness to meals built around fried meats, barbecue, or stews. You would find it in vintage cookbooks, passed down from neighbors or scribbled on recipe cards with curled edges. It has mostly slipped off dinner tables today, but back then it turned humble ingredients into something worth gathering around. Families leaned on simple dishes like this to bring warmth to the table without spending much. It filled bellies and brought people together, reminding everyone how far frugal, clever cooking could go. Hogshead cheese was a dish that made full use of an animal, born from nose-to-tail traditions where nothing could be wasted. Despite its name, it contained no cheese at all, but was instead a cold cut made by boiling the head of a pig with spices, onions, and vinegar until the meat and gelatin formed a solid loaf. Once chilled, it was sliced and served cold, often with crackers or bread. For rural Southerners, hogshead cheese was practical, economical, and surprisingly flavorful. It reflected a time when families valued every scrap and could not afford to throw anything away. Children might have balked at the idea, but many adults treasured its rich taste. Hogshead cheese was also sold in local butcher shops and became a staple of working-class lunches. Today, it is rare to find outside specialty stores or heritage festivals, its strong flavor and rustic origins falling out of favor. Still, it tells the story of thrift, resilience, and respect for every part of the hog. Iron pot split. Pea soup with salted ham hock was the slow-simmered comfort that sustained hunters through the bitterest winter nights. Dried peas soaked in cool water overnight were poured into a heavy pot along with chunks of smoked ham hock and a scattering of onions and carrots. The mixture bubbled gently beside the hearth for hours, the peas breaking down into a creamy base while the pork released deep smoky flavor. The scent filled cabins and canvas tents alike, promising warmth and nourishment when snow drifted high against the walls. Served with coarse bread or a slice of bannock, each bowl offered steady energy for long days of trapping or chopping wood. Children slurped it eagerly, the rich broth clinging to their spoons and warming their hands. This soup required little more than time and patience, yet delivered both comfort and vital strength. Today, quick-dried mixes cannot match the depth of flavor earned by a night of slow cooking over glowing coals and the quiet satisfaction of a meal born from simple ingredients. Cornflake-topped vegetable medley was the crunchy, thrifty side dish that showed up at potlucks and family dinners, straight from those old spiral-bound cookbooks. You would take canned or frozen vegetables, stir them with cream sauce, pour it into a casserole dish, and finish it with a layer of crushed cornflakes before baking. It sounds unusual now, but back then, this topping was genius. It added crunch, stretched ingredients, and turned plain vegetables into something hearty. Cornflake-topped vegetable medley earned its spot at the table because it made basic produce feel dressed up enough for guests or holidays. It sat proudly next to meatloaf, roast turkey, or ham, offering crispy contrast to heavier mains. Families loved it for how easy it was to throw together, how well it traveled to potlucks, and how much kids liked the crunchy topping. You hardly see it now, but back then, that golden cornflake crust meant you brought your best, even when groceries were tight. It proved simple ingredients could still make a meal feel special and complete. Sorghum molasses. Stack cake was more than a dessert. It was a centerpiece of Appalachian weddings and celebrations. Families in the mountains could not afford elaborate tiered cakes, so they created this dish by stacking thin layers of cake, often baked by different neighbors, with a filling made of sorghum molasses and stewed apples. The result was a dense, sweet cake that grew moister and more flavorful the longer it rested. Sorghum molasses, cheaper than sugar, added depth and a rustic sweetness unique to the region. Each layer symbolized the contribution of family and community, turning the cake into more than food. It was a collective expression of joy. Though once beloved, it faded as refined sugar and store-bought cakes became accessible, leaving stack cakes as a fading memory. Today, they survive mostly in regional cookbooks or heritage festivals, rarely baked in modern kitchens. Yet the sorghum molasses stack cake endures in memory as proof of how Southern cooks transformed scarcity into celebration. Its absence today is not just the loss of a recipe, but the fading of a cultural ritual of sharing and resilience. Cottage cheese salad was the quiet hero of mid-century potlucks and family suppers, even if no one talks about it much anymore. You would start with a scoop of plain cottage cheese, soft, tangy, and mild. Then fold in fruit like pineapple, sliced peaches, or even chopped tomatoes depending on the occasion. Some versions leaned sweet with whipped cream or gelatin, others stayed savory with cucumbers or chives. Either way, it was a refreshing, creamy dish that needed no cooking and very little prep. It was served chilled on a lettuce leaf or in a glass bowl, the kind that caught the sunlight just right. It might not have turned heads, but it always got eaten. Cottage cheese salad was something you made when you wanted to offer something light, simple, and just a little different. It was affordable, nutritious, and versatile, ideal for hot summers or holiday tables alike. Today, it has all but vanished, replaced by packaged sides or dressed-up grain salads. But those who remember it know how comforting that cool, creamy bite could be. Sometimes the quietest dishes are the hardest to forget. Corn pudding casserole was the side dish that made even the humblest dinner plate feel warm and complete. If you flipped through old recipe cards tucked behind flour jars, chances are this one was written in your grandmother's handwriting. It combined sweet corn, butter, eggs, and milk into a creamy bake that sat proudly next to roast ham or pork chops. It was easy, affordable, and filled bellies, making it a go-to for potlucks, church suppers, and holidays. The top baked up golden brown, the inside stayed soft and rich, and every bite reminded you how folks pulled meals together from what they had. Corn pudding casserole carried meals through tough times, earning its place in kitchens from the Depression to the 70s. You do not see it much now, but back then, that creamy baked corn meant comfort on a plate. Corn Dodger cakes were dense patties of cornmeal fried in bacon grease, built to endure long hunts and endless trails. Trappers stirred ground corn with hot water and a touch of salt, shaping the mixture into thick rounds that held together without eggs or milk. Dropped into sizzling grease, they crisped on the outside while staying firm inside, creating a portable bread that resisted spoilage. Wrapped in cloth, the cakes traveled in saddlebags and coat pockets, ready to be eaten cold or warmed briefly over a fire. Their sturdy texture and rich smoky flavor gave quick energy to hunters crossing ridges or rivers. Many men claimed the taste improved after a day in the pack as the bacon fat soaked deeper into the corn. At night, the cake served as both side dish and main meal when meat was scarce. Today, the name survives mostly in old stories, but the hearty crunch of a true corn dodger remains a symbol of rugged independence and frontier practicality. Parched corn snack was a pocket-sized taste of Southern thrift and tradition, perfect for long afternoons on the porch or walks through the fields. Dried corn kernels were slowly pan-toasted in a heavy iron skillet until each kernel puffed slightly and released a warm, nutty aroma. Grandmothers stirred the corn constantly to keep it from scorching, seasoning it only with a pinch of salt once the toasting was complete. The result was a crunchy snack that kept well in jars and traveled easily in pockets or small sacks, making it a favorite for children exploring woods and streams. It carried the sweet, earthy flavor of the harvest in every bite and required no sugar or fancy additions to satisfy. Families often made large batches after the corn harvest to enjoy through the winter months. Parched corn snack remains a simple reminder of times when the land provided both food and entertainment, and when the careful hand of a grandmother could transform plain grain into something worth remembering. Ambrosia. Salad with fresh coconut was not the quick throw-together dish we see at modern potlucks, but a true labor of love. Families grated fresh coconut by hand, a time-consuming process that often required a special tool or sheer determination. Oranges were peeled and sectioned, sometimes layered with pineapple, sugar, and the freshly grated coconut in glass bowls that sparkled with color. This dish often appeared during the holidays, especially Christmas, when citrus fruits were abundant and coconuts became available in markets. Children looked forward to the sweetness, while adults valued its symbolism of abundance in lean times. Ambrosia meant more than fruit salad. It was a ritual that tied families together through both labor and enjoyment. Every bite reflected the season's generosity, even if resources were otherwise tight. Modern versions made with canned fruit and bagged coconut lacked the painstaking care of the original. Forgotten by many, the old-fashioned version reminds us of a time when effort in the kitchen was an act of devotion and celebration. Its disappearance is not just about food, but about lost traditions of gathering and gratitude. Stuffed baked onions were the kind of dish that made you think Grandma knew a little magic. She would peel and hollow out big yellow onions, then fill them with a warm mixture of breadcrumbs, herbs, and maybe a bit of sausage if meat was on hand. Then she would roast them until the outside was soft and golden and the center bubbled with flavor. The smell alone would bring people into the kitchen. It was impressive without trying too hard. Just an onion, transformed into something elegant. You might find them at a Sunday dinner or as a side for a special roast. They looked like something out of a restaurant, but were made from the humblest ingredients. Stuffed onions stretched the grocery budget and elevated whatever else was on the plate. You would cut through the tender layers with a fork and get a mix of sweetness and savory warmth. It is hard to imagine a time when onions took center stage like that, but Grandma knew how to make the most of what she had. Today, we just chop them and toss them in a pan. Back then, they were stars. Ash-roasted sweet potatoes captured the warmth of the hearth in a method older than most family recipes. Grandmothers nestled whole sweet potatoes directly into the glowing embers of a wood fireplace, letting the natural sugars slowly caramelize under the blackened skin. The potatoes emerged tender and smoky, their soft orange flesh carrying a depth of flavor that no modern oven could quite match. Children gathered near the fire, eager for the moment when the potatoes were lifted out with long tongs and wrapped in clean cloths to cool just enough for holding. A simple sprinkle of salt or a pat of fresh butter was all that was needed to turn the humble root into a winter night feast. The process required patience, but little else, making it a perfect example of turning necessity into comfort. Ash-roasted sweet potatoes evoke evenings filled with crackling firelight, family stories, and the quiet satisfaction of food cooked by the heart and by the hearth itself. Rabbit and dumplings gave mountain families a way to stretch scarce protein into a feast when resources ran low. Hunters snared or shot cottontail rabbits, cleaned them swiftly, and browned the pieces in a seasoned pot. Water, onions, and wild herbs turned the meat into a savory broth that simmered for hours until every bone released its flavor. Simple dumplings of flour, fat, and cold water were pinched into the pot, where they puffed and softened, soaking up the rich stock. The meal offered nourishment and warmth after long days of trapping or woodcutting, its aroma filling cabins with a promise of comfort. Children eagerly waited for the first ladleful, while elders shared quiet stories of endurance and respect for the game that fed them. Today's store-bought meat and ready-made soups have replaced such deliberate preparation, but the memory of rabbit and dumplings lingers as a reminder of how patience, skill, and gratitude once turned a modest catch into a sustaining mountain supper shared with love. Baked apples with raisins and cinnamon was the spiced, sweet side dish that brought cozy comfort to dinner tables, especially when ingredients were scarce. You would core apples, fill them with raisins, brown sugar, and cinnamon, and bake them until bubbling with syrupy goodness. It was simple, affordable, and made with pantry staples that stretched meals and added sweetness to the table. Baked apples showed up at Sunday suppers, holidays, and weeknight meals, pairing perfectly with roast pork, fried chicken, or even standing alone as a humble dessert. Recipes like this came straight from vintage cookbooks, passed down by generations who knew how to stretch groceries and make the most of what they had. You hardly see them now, but back then, those warm cinnamon apples filled kitchens with that sweet, spiced aroma that made even the hardest days feel softer. They were simple comfort straight from the oven, reminding families how far a little resourcefulness could go. Jellied cabbage salad might sound like a dare today, but in Grandma's kitchen, it was a dish of pride. This was not some jiggly dessert. This was savory gelatin, made with cabbage, carrots, vinegar, and sometimes a hint of onion or celery. The gelatin was clear and firm, often made with tomato or lemon juice instead of just water. The vegetables were suspended in it like little windows into the garden. It was served cold, sliced into neat squares, and always had a place at the table during luncheons or church dinners. Some versions were topped with mayonnaise or set into ring molds with a little lettuce garnish in the center. You had to have grown up with it to understand why it mattered. It was refreshing, texturally strange, but oddly satisfying. Today, we turn our noses up at savory gelatin, but back then, it was a sign of effort and hospitality. A dish that took time, not shortcuts. Maybe it is time we looked at those odd recipes again, with curiosity instead of judgment. Blackberry dumplings were once a highlight of southern summers, made when berries ripened along hedgerows and farm fields. Families would gather buckets of wild blackberries, then stew them with sugar until they formed a sweet, fragrant sauce. Into this bubbling mixture, cooks dropped spoonfuls of simple dough that puffed into soft dumplings as they simmered. The result was a dessert that was both filling and joyful, capturing the taste of summer in every bite. Children loved helping pick berries, often sneaking handfuls as they worked, while adults valued the chance to turn free fruit into a crowd pleaser. Blackberry dumplings were often served with milk or cream if available, making them even more indulgent. They were the kind of dish that brought neighbors together, with everyone pitching in during harvest. Today, they have nearly vanished, replaced by store-bought pies and packaged desserts. Their disappearance is a loss of flavor and tradition, because blackberry dumplings carried with them the sweetness of both the land and the season. Campfire Dutch oven. Peach cobbler turned rugged campsites into places of sweet reward after days of hard labor. Hunters or homesteaders opened precious cans of peaches saved from summer and poured them into a cast-iron pot, topping them with biscuit dough mixed on the spot. The lid was covered with glowing coals, and the cobbler baked slowly as night settled over the mountains. The scent of fruit and butter rose into the cool air, drawing every tired traveler toward the fire. When the lid lifted, golden crust revealed bubbling peach syrup that dripped onto tin plates. This dessert was more than a treat. It was proof that even in the wilds, a taste of comfort and celebration was possible. Children scraped the pot clean while adults savored the rare sweetness, knowing the peaches might be the only fruit for weeks. Modern camping desserts cannot match the simple magic of cobbler baked under stars with nothing but iron, fire, and patience to guide it. Wilted lettuce salad with vinegar dressing was the forgotten side dish that brought warmth, tang, and a little bacon grease magic to family tables all across the South. You would take fresh lettuce, usually straight from the garden, pour hot bacon drippings mixed with vinegar, sugar, and a pinch of salt over the top, and watch the greens wilt down into tender, flavorful bites. It sounds odd to serve salad that way today, but back then, this was comfort food at its finest. Families leaned on recipes like this to use up garden produce, stretch ingredients, and add a hearty, savory side to meals without spending extra money. Wilted lettuce salad was a regular at potlucks, Sunday suppers, and backyard gatherings, sitting proudly next to fried chicken, biscuits, or whatever main dish folks scraped together. You could dress it up with sliced onions, hard-boiled eggs, or crumbled bacon when you had extra to spare. Breaded eggplant rounds were a summer favorite that tasted like fried sunshine. Grandma would slice eggplants into thick coins, dip them in egg and breadcrumbs, sometimes with a bit of cornmeal, and fry them until golden and crisp. They were salty on the outside, creamy on the inside, and just hearty enough to stand in for meat when money was tight. You could serve them on their own, with tomato sauce, or tucked into a sandwich with melted cheese. They were messy to make and disappeared faster than she could fry them. The best ones were fresh from the garden, deep purple and still warm from the sun. Eggplant was not always a kid favorite, but this dish changed minds quickly. It was comfort food with a little bit of crunch and a lot of history. Today, eggplant shows up more in global recipes than in Grandma's style of home cooking. But back then, it was a clever way to make something simple feel satisfying. Cornpone was a dish tied directly to survival. A cornbread stripped of luxury and made with nothing but cornmeal, water, and salt. Unlike cornbread enriched with milk, eggs, or sugar, cornpone was dense, chewy, and often cooked in a skillet or even on hot stones near a fire. It was the food of farmers, laborers, and families with little more than a sack of cornmeal to last the week. Despite its simplicity, corn pone carried dignity because it kept people alive during lean years. It was eaten plain, with beans, or crumbled into milk or pot liquor for extra nourishment. Children grew up on it, and older generations remembered it as a symbol of persistence when choices were scarce. Though not glamorous, it filled stomachs and carried people through desperate times. As prosperity grew, corn pone was replaced by softer, sweeter breads, leaving it nearly forgotten. Yet its legacy remains in the memory of grandparents who knew its importance. Corn pone tells the story of survival through simplicity, a dish that gave strength when little else could. Spinach timbales were a dish that made vegetables feel like something grand. Grandma would mix cooked spinach with eggs, cream, and a handful of breadcrumbs, pour the mixture into small molds, and bake them until they puffed and set. The result was a delicate custard-like mound that held its shape and tasted rich and savory. It looked fancy, but was often made from leftovers or frozen spinach, which made it even more impressive. These little timbales were served warm with a drizzle of cheese sauce or gravy and were a regular part of dinner parties or special Sunday meals. They had that old-fashioned air of formality that came from caring about presentation, even when money was tight. Spinach timbales were quiet showstoppers, the kind of dish that made people stop and take note without saying a word. They are rarely seen today outside of vintage cookbooks or culinary schools, but for a time they were proof that vegetables could be elegant too. Maybe we would all eat more greens if they were served like this again. Fire-roasted trout offered a meal as fresh as the rushing streams where it was caught. After a day spent following icy creeks, hunters cleaned the silvery fish with swift hands, sprinkling only salt and maybe a squeeze of wild lemon if fortune allowed. Green sapling sticks became natural skewers, holding each trout above a crackling fire until the skin blistered and the flesh turned opaque and flaky. The scent of pine smoke mingled with the sweet aroma of fish, calling companions to the circle of stones around the flames. No heavy pans or complicated spices were needed, only patience to turn the sticks until the meat cooked evenly. The first bite revealed pure mountain flavor, delicate and clean, a reward for hours of casting lines or setting nets in cold water. Modern anglers may pack foil and seasonings, but the unadorned pleasure of trout roasted directly over wood coals remains unmatched, a taste of wild rivers and clear night skies that nourished both body and spirit. Poke salad greens were a classic example of Depression-era foraging turned into food tradition, though they required care and skill. Pokeweed grows wild across the South, and its young leaves were harvested, boiled, and drained several times to remove natural toxins. Once prepared safely, the greens were fried with bacon fat or mixed into stews, providing a much-needed source of vitamins. For poor rural families, poke salad represented survival, turning something free and wild into a filling side dish. It was not glamorous, but it carried the pride of resourcefulness in desperate times. Poke salad suppers even became community events in some areas, celebrating a food that was both humble and dangerous if mishandled. Children grew up knowing that only the young leaves were safe to eat, while older parts of the plant were poisonous. Today, few people bother with the time or risk, leaving poke salad largely forgotten except in folklore. It remains a powerful reminder of how closely people once lived with the land. Prairie hen. Fricassee filled rough cabins with the comforting aroma of slow-braised game birds bathed in cream and wild herbs gathered along mountain trails. Hunters cleaned the prairie hens with careful hands, browning the meat in heavy iron pots before adding onions, garlic, and a splash of spring water. A small measure of cream or milk, if it could be spared, created a velvety sauce that simmered for hours until the birds turned tender and the broth thickened into a rich gravy. Families served the fricassee with coarse bread or boiled root vegetables, each bite a blend of earthy herbs and gentle smoke from the fire. This dish transformed lean wild game into something elegant, proving that frontier cooks valued both nourishment and quiet pleasure. Around the hearth, elders shared stories of long hunts across open grasslands while children eagerly awaited their share of the tender meat. Though prairie hens have grown scarce and cream is no longer a rare treasure, the memory of this rustic yet graceful meal remains a tribute to patience and the simple luxury of good company. These 25 dishes did not vanish because they failed. They vanished because the kitchen they belonged to vanished first. The wood-burning hearth, the ham bone in the back of the pantry, the hen on the roost, the crock of souse on the cold porch. Pull a recipe out of your grandmother's tin box this Saturday, roll the dumpling thin, drop the Calas in hot lard, stir the Brunswick stew until your shoulder aches. Sit at the table, not the couch. Tell somebody the name of the cook who taught it to you. Because these meals were never just food. They were the proudest plates a poor South ever set, and they only stay alive if you keep cooking them.